Well, welcome, everyone. Looks like we might have a small group today, but I think we should go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the last of our 4 trainings on mobile data collection platform CommCare. You may have noticed that I'm not the voice you're used to hearing on these sessions. I'm Ann Goforth. I'm the Interim Technical Advisor for the Meta project, and I'm filling in for Meg today. My colleague Smita is providing technical support with the login Jamie Costigan. So if you are having any kinds of technical issues, please, you can send her a chat. So our facilitator today is Jeremy Waxman of Demaji, which is the software company that produces CommCare. I'm not sure if you all have been able to join the previous sessions or watch the recordings. If you are just joining us now, you're more than welcome to follow along, but if you would like to complete the steps described independently, you will need to review the previous recordings, and you can find links to the Meta website and Demaji Academy in the invitation to these trainings, and that's where you'll be able to view the recordings. So please note that all attendees are currently muted. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat throughout the training, and we'll address them during the Q&A session. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jeremy to get started.
Great, thanks so much, Ann. Excited to kind of close the loop here with this this final session. Just to echo what Ann was saying, there are some resources posted on the Meta project and the Demaji Academy course. And so if you go in there, you can find the webinar recordings. So for session 1 through 3, they've already been posted. You can view those there, as well as independent practice, which parallels what was presented in the webinar with some additional guidance, and then additional resources just to address questions that come up or have come up in the prior webinars. So definitely check that out. And there's also a discussion forum in there where a couple questions have been posted, and we'll be monitoring those forums through the end of the month in case you have additional questions you want to post. Great, so this is, as I mentioned, the last of the 4 training sessions on CommCare as a mobile data collection tool and case management tool. And originally this session was just titled Publishing and Installing Your Application. But in the last session, we actually already installed the application. So we'll review publishing updates to the application today and have broadened the scope of this presentation a little bit to include some more advanced case management tools, which were hinted at the end of the session 3 webinar, as well as a bit more on data management. We've been focusing a lot on application development. We'll also touch on how you access that data later on so you can do whatever analysis you need to do with it. So just a quick recap, the first session we spent mostly talking at a very high level about mobile data collection in the CommCare platform. And then for the purposes of continuity to today's presentation, we really started getting into the details in session 2, where we were building out a basic data collection tool. So we went over some app design practices. We went on a tour of CommCare HQ to get oriented to the different sections, such as the app builder, reporting data, and then used the form builder to build out a basic questionnaire based on a survey intake form for community health promoters. And we used a preview functionality to check out what our form looked like. Last time, we built upon that client intake form and added an evaluation form. Along with that, we added some complexity to those forms, including display conditions, also known as skip logic, and validation conditions to really take advantage of some of the advantages offered by mobile data collection. Form calculations within a form, so that's another nice feature of some digital systems is you can add in some complexity like that. So we used that to calculate age based on date of birth, as well as to do scoring based on a evaluation form. We did some displaying of information that was collected, and then finally at the end of the session, we used case management to link the client intake and evaluation forms, which were related to the same client, and installed the app on the phone. So that's where we'll pick up today. We're going to add one more form today, which is going to be used to update client information. And along with that, we'll show just a little taste of advanced case management to link data across forms. We kind of went through app installation already, but I will demonstrate the app update process once more. And then we'll jump over to CommCare HQ to look at some of the reporting functionality, as well as how to create exports so you can view that data in Excel and do whatever further analysis you want. At the very end, I'll just touch on some next steps you can take if you're curious to learn more about CommCare or about mobile data collection. And then there'll be a course survey and wrap up at the end. With that, I'll jump over into the demonstration. So just to get everyone up to speed, I'm going to start with the mobile application that we were working on last time. So this was our CHP app, and I'm just going to log in with the username Sarah and get started here. And as you may recall, we had two modules in our application. We had a client intake component and an evaluation component. And so if you recall, at the end, we set it up so when you fill out the client intake form, you add all this information about a client and you submit that form. In addition to sending that data to the server where you can access that data, what we did is we took that information and kept a portion of it on the phone using case management, such that now when we try to access the evaluation, we see a list of all of the people who are registered, all the clients who have been registered. And we have a bit of a record about each one of them right here on the device. And so when we click on one of them, we have the opportunity to update that record and to fill out additional forms which will be linked to that same client record. So moving on from that, I want to add a little more complexity to this still. And so I'm going to hop back over to CommCare HQ to the application builder. So here's what you just saw on the mobile. You saw the client intake module with the client intake form inside of that, and you saw an evaluation module with an evaluation form. So one thing that you may find is, unlike a paper system, if you need to change something, it takes a little more intentional design for how you're going to accommodate that. So for example, you may want to update a client status over time, or you may want to be able to change the phone number or name freely. Once data is submitted to the server, it's there, and there's sort of a permanent record, and there are some data management features I'll touch on in the second portion of today's session, which allow you to modify data if, for example, there was an error. So say you filled out a form, and then you realized that actually the address was totally wrong, or you put down the wrong person's address. So in a paper system where you could just go in and erase that and write in something new, that flexibility we have to kind of design in here. And you can modify it once it's already on the server, but there may be some fields that you want, in this example, community health promoter, to be able to modify directly. Again, the examples maybe being phone number, which maybe the phone number changes frequently and you want to be able to keep track of that client, or the address changing, or correcting spelling mistakes, that type of thing. So what I want to do is I'm going to add another form, which is going to be used to update client info. And I'm going to give that form two functions. One is to change the value of some key pieces of information about that client. And the second function is going to be to actually remove that client. If, for example, I accidentally registered someone twice, or imagine that I am done providing services and I don't want them to be in my list on my phone anymore. So I'm going to go to my evaluation module, and I want this module now to have more than one purpose. I'm just going to change the name to evaluation and follow-up. And then I'm going to add a new form, so pushing the plus form button, and let's call this form update client info. And then click on edit to get started with our form. So as I build out this form, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open the client intake form here so you can see that as a comparison. You may remember from the first couple, or the second and third sessions, we spent a lot of time on this client intake form. And when we were linking the case management, we saved some of these as records about the client. Like we saved the name, the date of birth, etc. And so what we want this new form to be able to do is provide the opportunity to the community health promoter, the user of the app, to see what was collected previously and be able to modify it. So we could go into this update client info form and just start adding a new question. So say we want to be able to update the client's name, we could add a new name field and call it client name and fill in all these fields just like you do for a normal question. Or if we want to make sure that those questions are exactly the same, I'm just going to delete this one I just added. I can go to my client intake form, this is that original form, and I can copy and paste these questions into a new form. So say I want to take client name, date of birth, maybe all the way down to, let's do these five items. So I can highlight all of those using Control and then do a Control C just like you would in any other system. And then I can go over to this other form and just paste those in. And now those are all exactly the same as they were, and I've saved myself some time. And let's copy over a few more things. So maybe we think address and phone number are also things that are likely to change. So I can highlight those, copy them, and then paste them into this form. As a side note, if you can use that same multiple select functionality to change the order of things. So say you wanted to move address to the very end, you could grab address and move it down, or you could grab a couple questions at one time by using the select plus shift, and you can drag them to different places in the form. So it makes kind of adding changes later on much easier. Great, so we've got some of the questions in here that we know we want to update. So right now I just added this new form. So this form isn't yet associated with the client. So in order to do that, I'm going to click on Update Client Info to go to the form settings. If you have any questions along the way here, feel free to interrupt. I know I'm moving a little fast, so I want to make sure I get all of this covered today. I'm going to go to the Case Management tab, and right now, just like on the when we added these forms on the last two sessions, it starts out as does not use cases. I'm going to say this again: updates or closes a case. I'm just going to do that. I'm going to leave everything else blank for now and just click Save. And now that I've linked this to the case type, just like this evaluation form is linked in, I can go back into the form. So I can use this little shortcut here to go directly into editing a form. And now there's this box here that's shown up in the bottom left, the case properties box. And what I have here is a record of all the case properties, all those pieces of data that I have stored about every client. So if I go here, and I can scroll down and see all these different pieces of information. And so this is a pretty powerful tool once you have done this initial setup. And I'll just demonstrate a couple ways that this is really useful. So imagine in this program that people's phone numbers are changing all the time. And whenever you go into this Update Client Info, you really want to highlight to the CHP that they should double check that the phone number is still right. So I could add a label here at the top. And maybe we'll call this Verify Phone. And I can say, verify that the client's phone number is still up to date. Okay, and I can drag the case property called primary phone into the label here. And now, just like we used this sort of display to show age in a calculation, I can show the client's phone number by just dragging that from the list of all the data that I have stored about that client. And I'll show you what that looks like on the phone in just a moment. The other thing I want to do with this form is I want to pre-populate these fields with the value that was inputted during the client intake form. So right now, if I deploy this, all these fields will be blank. They're just going to be questions like they were in the client intake form. But I want them to have a default value that is whatever was entered during the intake, whatever is stored in these case properties. So if I click on client name that we've talked about before, like question ID, so that's what the data is tagged as. You'll see the label. This is what the mobile worker, the CHP, is seeing, and these display and validation conditions. But now there's this extra option here called default value. So what I can do is I can take my my case name, which is my client name, and I can drag that into the default value. And now when I view this question on the phone, it's going to pre-populate it with whatever I recorded during the client intake process. So I'm going to set up the rest of these questions to do the same thing. So this is date of birth. Let me drag in DOB, sex, and primary phone number. And I don't think I've saved secondary phone numbers. I'm just going to delete that for now. And let's do address. Great, so I've set default values for all of these. And I want to use this same form. Maybe this is something you would do in multiple forms, but for simplicity here, I'm going to add something which says close case. I'm going to say, do you want to remove this client? And that can make that a yes/no question. If you have a form where you have lots of the same structures, so say you have a lot of yes/no questions, and just as a hint, using this copy and paste functionality can be really helpful. So you could take the yes or no question, do Control-C, Control-V, it'll make a copy of it, and then you can just change the question ID and the label without having to retype all of the options. So let's leave this question that says, do you want to remove the client? I'm going to make it required. So every time you fill out this form, you can go through and you have to validate all these fields, and then you have the option to remove this client. So there's one more step, and then we're going to jump over to seeing what this looks like on the phone. So I'm going to click again on Update Client Info and let that load. And so far what I've done is I've taken data that's collected at the time of client intake, and I've fed it into this client intake info. But what I want to do in this final step is I want to make sure if I change something in the Update Client Info form, that in turn updates what's in the record. So right now, the data is flowing from client intake into the record, and then from the record into Update Client Info. And I want to kind of close the loop by making Update Client Info update the record as well. So I'm going to go to the Case Management tab. Earlier, we already set this to be updates or closes a case. And now I'm going to go to Save Data to the following case properties. So I'm going to click on this little plus here. And I'm going to start choosing questions that are in this form that I want to update the record for. So let's do client name. If I go to this case property, you're going to see a list of all the possible values that I might want to update that are already in the system. So if I chose client name, I want to match that to name and so on. And because I've kept my IDs consistent throughout this application by doing the copy paste, this is very easy to do. So I can just save all of these here. I'll just add these. And then the last thing I want to do is I want to set this form to remove that case record if I answer yes to that question. So I'm going to say close this case when the form is complete, and I'm going to add a condition. I'm going to say only close this form if do you want to remove this client is yes. And I know we just did a lot of things. I'm going to show you what that all looks like on the phone to try to make it all a little bit clearer here. So as you may remember from the last session, once you make changes in the configurations or in the content of the forms, once you want those to go on the phone, you're going to need to click on this option that says Deploy. Once you're on the deploy screen, you can see a list of all the versions of the application that you've made over time. I'm going to make a new one now. And then I'm just going to add a comment to remind myself later what this version did. So this was adding update client info form. Okay, so last time I installed the app on my phone, and you already saw that I have it over here. And right now, I'm using this version that I installed earlier today, version 88. Can you reference this number here? And so if I go onto my phone and I say Update App, it's going to check, and it says it's already up to date, that I'm already using version 88, and that's what you see here. But if I go here onto my deploy list and I say I want to release this new version 98, then I can go back to the phone here and click on check, and now what it's done is it saw there is something more recent than 88 that had a star on it, so it's going to update to that version. So the update's done. I just have to click on this update button here. And then I can log in again using the new version of the app. Great, so I'm going to go to Start again, and you can see now that the name of this module has updated to Evaluation and Follow-up. Let me click here on that module, and I can see a list of clients that were previously registered. So I can choose one of these clients and see some basic information about them. I'm going to go back and forth a little bit. So if I choose Alexandra here, then now I have two options. I can do the evaluation, just like we saw in session 3, or this new update client info form. So let me go in here. So the first thing you can see is this prompt that I added at the beginning, which referenced the case data. So verify the client's phone number is still up to date. So that back in the form over here was when I dragged the primary phone number data field into this label here at the top. So this field has been replaced with whatever the value of primary_phone is for this particular client. Now, as I go through the different fields, you can see that they're pre-populated with the names that were associated with this client's record. So this is, if I go to client name, it's pulling the default value of case name, which came from the client intake. So I'm showing a little bit of the power of these case management linkages, but you can imagine these case properties here, you can use them for all kinds of things. You could use them for display conditions. So say you had a follow-up form and you only wanted to ask certain questions if the client was female. So you could use that case property as a display condition, just like you would use a display condition within the form. So let's say I want to make just a little update to the name here, so you can see what this looks like. And I'll add initial here. So I've made a change to it and say everything else here you can see is pre-populated. I'm just going to leave that as is. And I'll say I don't want to remove this client. I'm just updating. So now if I go back and click on my evaluation and follow-up, I can see that Alexander's name has been changed in accordance with whatever I just did in the update client info form, and that's updated on the database record as well, the spelling and styling of that name. Let's say I choose Evan here, and you can see we touched a little bit on in the last session on how you can set up what you see in this screen here, and this can be a really powerful way to do some work support to your staff here. So you can call directly from here. If I click on the phone, you can send a message or call. You can open the map and you can see where that particular client is. You can also do automatic GPS capture in addition to just writing in the address manually. So you have a bunch of options on the data that you can display here. So let's say I go into update client info and I want to remove this patient or this client. I'm done following up or whatever the reason is. So I'm just going to click through these screens here. I'm going to say I want to remove this client. So now when I return to the evaluation and follow-up, you can see that Evan has been removed. So that data is still available on the server, but interaction with the health provider is no longer, the health promoter is no longer required, so it's been removed from the device here. Great, maybe I'll pause just for a second and see if there's any questions at this time. If not, I'm just going to mention one question that I saw posted on the discussion board over the last couple of days, which was about device type. And so CommCare works on any Android device. It does not work on Apple products. Maybe in the future that's something we'll expand into, but in most of the places we work, the Android products are more readily available and affordable. So any tablet or phone using the Android system. CommCare also works on Java phones, like in these old Nokia phones. We work on some of those devices. Those devices are gradually being replaced just by smartphones like this. And then you can also do the web-based data entry on the desktop itself using the CloudCare tool, which we saw used to demonstrate what the workflow looks like. Great. If there's no questions, then I can jump on into the next component of what we wanted to talk about today, which was looking more at CommCare HQ and the data. So we've done a lot of work in the app builder here. We did some complex linking of things together. Let's see what all that data that's being collected actually looks like when we pull it up here. So if I'm on CommCare HQ, one thing I might want to know before even diving into the data is how many submissions are coming in. So if you're doing a big survey, maybe someone's going around and they're supposed to be doing 5 intake a day. There's some tools available under the Reports tab that will help you take a look at sort of monitor what the workforce is doing. I pulled up a couple examples here. So here's a report which is called Daily Form Activity. You can see a list of all the different worker activity reports here. And in this particular project, there are 7 workers registered. So you can see a list of all those usernames here. I was just using Sarah's login. And this particular form shows the number of submissions that are coming in per day for any type of form. I can see back on the 15th that the user demo submitted 4, no one else did anything. Today there have been 7 submissions, 4 of which came from Sarah. That was the username I was just using, 1 from Anne and 2 from that demo user. So this gives you a general sense of what like the volume of data that's coming in. Another example of this type of worker monitoring report is the submissions by form. So this is if you want to get a bit more granular and you just want to look at one activity, for example. Let's imagine I was curious about just how many client intake forms have been selected. So I can go to this report and I can choose a filter. So I can choose the CHP application because it's possible to have multiple applications in one project. I'm choosing the client intake module, and then I'm choosing the client intake form. and then I'll go ahead and load this. And so this report is again going to show a list of every worker who's registered in the project and how many intake forms they submitted over a given time period. So I left the time period at 7 days by default. So I can see there were a total of 7 client intakes completed over the last 7 days, and I can see who submitted each of these. Again, this is a good way just to do a basic snapshot of what's going on with your data collection, and you can save these reports and send them out as emails. That's a nice way. Say you want to be able to check in every Monday afternoon at what happened over the prior week. You can save these, and you can set up a scheduled report so that every Monday you'll get this report in your email, and you won't have to log into CommCare or anything like that. You can add other people who are not members of your CommCare project to get those reports if they're interested in following along with the activity.
Jeremy, sorry to interrupt. We did have one question about if the CHP removes a client by mistake.
Yeah, it's a great question. Adding that functionality, removing the client, makes it possible to remove people who are added by mistake. But if the converse happens, that you remove someone by mistake, then there's a couple things you can do. I think the most straightforward I will show you in just a moment, which has to do with archiving the form on the server. So maybe I'll jump into that one right now. So there's a number of different variations on these worker monitoring reports, which look at not just the number of forms coming in, but also maybe the frequency with which a particular client was visited and those types of information. What I want to do now, and this will also address this accidental closing scenario, is go to these reports that are called inspect data. So I'm going to go to this first one, which is called submit history. You can imagine submit history is just a time-based list of all the forms that have come into a particular project. Okay, so you can choose some or all of your users, and you can, again, filter by different applications. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to leave this with the last 7 days. I want to see all forms that have come in. And what this allows you to do is just like the name here says, inspect the data. So here are the forms that I just submitted during the demo a few minutes ago. This update client info, the first time to just show what it looked like, and the second time when we actually were closing out a case. So let me click on this form here, and we can see what that looks like as it reached the server. Great, so here is the update we did for Evan Smith. So if you look at this table here, you can see here's a list of all the questions that were contained in that form, and you can see a list of what was inputted there, what information was supplied. You can also see if you have any hidden values, so those are those calculation nodes. You can see the output of those here as well. And in case you have questions with similar names, you can view by those question IDs as well. And so I see that the question here, do you want to remove this client, is yes. And I can see a little more detail about that if I go to this case changes tab. I can see here's this overall record, this case, Evan Smith, and I can see that some fields were updated and that this case was closed here. So I'm just going to open this in a different tab. So in case you want to view more detail about this particular case, Evan Smith, I'm just opening another view of that. So here's that client named Evan Smith, when they were registered, when they were last updated, who did all of that. So you can see the mobile worker, Sarah, here. And I can see that this particular case was closed on September 22nd. And one of the prior sessions, we also mentioned there's an alphanumeric code for each case. And so that's what you're seeing here. This is the unique identifier for this particular case. And you see all this information about them here for each of these case properties. You also have an option to view a history of that particular case. So I can see that this person was registered earlier today and then closed through this form. So let's say that I accidentally submitted this form, like this close form. So I can go back to this form, and I have an option here to archive this form. And so what archiving does is it's very similar to deleting, but basically it hides the form from all the records. So you wouldn't see, if you archive a form, you wouldn't see it in the exports or anything. And it undoes any changes that were made to the case. So if I click on archive, it's going to go into the database and kind of remove the actions that were caused by this. And I can always undo my archive later by restoring this form. If I go back to the case record now and refresh it, everything goes according to plan. We should find that this closed on has been removed. Yep, so now this is an active case again. And if I go to the case history, it's as if that form was never submitted. And I just have that registration one. So that's a way to undo a form that was submitted in error. Another option, which is available on some of the software plans, is to edit the form. So when that's active, there'll be a third button here which says edit this form. You can click on that, and it will open up on the computer the form as it was submitted, and you could just go in and change yes to no, and then resave that. And then next time on the phone, if I go here now, that Evan case is not here, but if I go to this main page and I sync with server, it's going to check with the server and see what the latest information is about which cases are open and closed. And now, if I go back to the list, because I archived the form that closed Evan Smith, it's been restored now. So that's a little taste of what that data management looks like. And this is a good way as well if you just want to check in on some of the forms that are coming in. You can look at those. You can troubleshoot if there's something unexpected. You can find that particular form through this submit history report. Similarly, there's a second report which is called the Caseless Report. And if I pull that up, you'll see that this is a way that you can pull up on the computer a list of clients that is sort of in parallel to what's being shown on the phone. So I could pick a particular user. Let's say I want to do Sarah here. And then I can leave it as just the client. It's the only case shape, so I'll leave that. And you can show only open or only closed or all cases. So if you want to see exactly what they would see on the phone, you would choose open. And if you want to see all cases that they have registered, closed, modified over time, then you can leave it as all. If I pull this up, then I'll see here are the 4 cases that were registered by Sarah. And just like I went into Evan Smith and I could see details, I can go into any of these and see a more detailed record and go into those individual forms that have updated the record. So here's these case properties, and here's a history of forms that were submitted about this particular client. So those are the main components of the reporting section on CommCare. I'll just mention a couple things which won't go into detail here. You'll see there's a section called Manage Deployments. These are useful if you have a lot of people using an application in your project and you need to be able to do some monitoring on a more technical side, such as is everyone using the right version of the application? When is the last time that each user submitted a form? Those types of things. And then CommCare is integrated with text messaging, so you can also do some investigation of anything that's going on through text message. There's also a new feature called the Report Builder, so you can build some basic indicator-based reports. You'll notice that all of these worker monitoring reports are based on sort of metadata about the worker activity, number of forms submitted, when forms were submitted, when client cases were updated, that type of thing. But if you wanted to have a report that was more like what portion of clients are male and female, then you can use the Report Builder feature to build out some of those reports. So I think for the remaining time here, I'm going to jump over to the data section so you could walk through how you actually export that data so that you can do further analysis with it. I'm going to go to the data section here. When I go into the data section, there are 2 main components, one being export forms and one being export cases. So I think Alex talked about this a little bit in some of the initial sessions, but exporting forms is, just like it sounds, exporting the data form-wise. So we had 3 forms now in our application. We have client intake, evaluation, and update client info. And so if we do an export, for example, for client intake, then we're going to have 1 row for each client intake that was completed. If, however, we do an export case approach, then that's 1 row for each client that's been registered. So if you had, for example, there's this update client info form we just added. If you had that for a particular client over the course of your interactions, maybe you filled that out 3 or 4 times. So that would show up as 3 or 4 rows in the form export. But in the export cases, it would still be just 1 row per client, and it would show the most recent value for every column in that export. So I'll walk through one example export, and then we'll have a little bit of time in case there's some extra questions. So I don't have any exports yet, so I'm going to create an export. And let's say I want to create a form-wise export for my client intake. So I'm going to choose my CHP application, my client intake module, and my client intake form. Once I do that, I just get a little message that says there's 7 form submissions available. Just gives me a sense of the scale of the data, that I'm going to be downloading here. I'm going to say create export. And so I'm going to walk through this process of designing an export, and you really only have to do this one time. And then when you come back, you can download that export again, and it'll be the same configuration. There'll just be more rows in it. So I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. So for this export name, let's just say this is the client intake form. And you can specify a couple of different file types. I'm just going to make this an Excel file. You have a couple different formatting options. I think the easiest thing to do is just to leave all these by default, and there's more information on the help site about why you might want to change some of these depending upon what you're doing. Then I get down to the meat of the export configuration here, and you can see there's all the different fields that were built into this client intake form. So if I go into client intake, you'll see that, let me pull this here, you'll see that these questions, these IDs right here, are the question IDs that were listed when we built out the form over here. And so a list of all those questions. There's also some some metadata which is automatically captured. So you can see when the form was started, when it was completed, when it reached the server, who filled it out, and some data about the cases that were created. The third column over here lets you specify the column header. So by default, it's going to show whatever this form dot and then the question ID. And you can modify those and sort of type in whatever it is you want. You also have the option to use question labels. So if I do that, then you can see very clearly it just pulls whatever was entered as the label in here. So let's make a sort of simple export. Let's say we just want a handful of columns in our export. I'm going to start with selecting none. And let's say we want to include the name, date of birth, sex, date of arrival, and maybe we just want some basic location information, address, phone number, email. We can rearrange these a little bit if we want. So maybe we want to have, maybe the primary phone number should be one of the first things we see. So I'll just drag that up there. So now I have the first column, second column, etc. And then maybe I also want a little extra information like when this form was completed and maybe who filled it out. So I selected a handful of fields there. Maybe I'll just change this to show what this looks like. I'm going to change it to client_name, and I'll leave these other displays just like they are right now. Then I'm going to go ahead and click on Create. Great. Now when I come to my export form section, I'm going to have this form or this export already designed. So next time I can just come directly here, click on Export, and I have some filtering options. So I can choose user types. I can choose specific subsets of users, and I can choose a date range, and then click on Prepare Export. Once it's ready, I'll just click Download, and then I can see my data in the spreadsheet form. And so you can see that the column headers are pulled from that furthest right component of the export setup, and one row for every form that was submitted, as well as the metadata here. So I can see Sarah submitted most of these. I can see some from demo user, et cetera. And if I had archived one of these, say someone was registered by accident, then that would remove it from this export. So that's the basic process for setting up a form export. And there's a activity posted for this week if you want to try doing something similar but with a case export. So I think we're getting close to the end here. So I just wanted to briefly mention, and then maybe we'll have if there's any questions before we do the course survey, that in the course on Demagi Academy, we've posted some exercises that kind of walk through what we did today, adding that update client info form as well as the CommCare data, so creating a case export explained there. And then this webinar will be posted in the coming days on both metasupport.org as well as academy.mogi.com. I just did want to mention a couple other quick things. You're still free to email us if you have questions or run into any issues at academy@mogi.com, and to post questions in discussion forum, and we'll monitor those through the end of the month. If you want to keep learning more and exploring, I'll just highlight this link here, which is mogi.com/learn, and this links to a bunch of the key resources that you'll find valuable in exploring further, a bunch of documentation, as well as other online courses. On the Mogi Academy, there's a course on app building if you're interested in that in some more detail, as well as how to get support if you run into any issues or have any questions. So with that, if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer those, but I definitely appreciate everyone's participation.
Thanks, Jeremy. Since this is the last session in this series, we'd love to take a few moments to collect participants' feedback. And we'll go ahead and open a link here that you can click through in order to provide us with feedback. So thanks, Samita, for uploading that. Please go ahead and complete that at your own pace. And in the meantime, I thought we could see if there were any questions on the last part of the presentation. I know I had one, and I'm not sure whether I missed something, but I was wondering if you had deleted a client, but then you wanted actually them to be included in the report. Was that something that was brought up?
Sure. So if you close the client case, then that's not going to affect the data that was submitted in the form. So that form is still going to show up in the export. If you're doing a form export. If you're doing a case-wise export and you close that case, then again, it depends how you filter the data, but in general, that case will still show up, but there'll be an optional column that says, I think it says closed or status or something, and it will say whether that particular client case is open or closed, whether it's active or inactive, and then you can filter that if you only wanted to see active ones or something. I think for a lot of data analysis purposes, if you're doing a big survey or something or a big intake form, then it's easier to do that type of analysis looking form-wise. So you have all those fields and you don't have to worry, you're not concerned maybe about the status of a particular client. You just want to see a simple kind of one row per submission. That's the way to go. If you're doing something operational, say you wanted to create an export, which is the example in the that's posted on Mogi Academy. Say you wanted to export something that had one row for every client and it showed what their current phone number and address is, then that would be better to do using a case export because it'll reflect the most recent value wherever that was entered, and it will show you kind of who's open and closed and that type of thing.
Okay, great, thanks. Any other questions? We still have Jeremy on the line.
Yeah, I saw one just posted in the chat about importing existing data. So there is a data management tool called the Excel import tool. So say you already had 1,000 clients that you're serving, then you could put that in an Excel file and configure it to match the application. So that's just to say if you have a question in your intake form that is asks for, I don't know, for gender and it's coded a certain way, then you would want it to be coded the same in the data you're importing. But then you can run that import, and then if you specify which worker each case that you're importing should go to, then you could pre-populate the phones basically using existing data, if that answers the question.
Okay, terrific. So I guess if there are no further questions, we will go ahead and bring the session to a close. This is now the conclusion of the Meta CommCare training series, and we want to thank our facilitators very much, Alexandra and Jeremy, for hosting these sessions with us and providing us all of the supplementary Mogi Academy learning opportunities. And as Jeremy mentioned, if you'd like to review this training or any of the other trainings, they are recorded and posted on the Meta website as well as on the Mogi Academy. And we will be adding this recording shortly. As always, if you have any questions or comments, you can email meta@rescue.org or get in touch on Twitter at US Meta Support. Thanks everyone for joining, and I hope you have a nice evening. Thank you.
Thanks everyone.